I am extremely thrilled to introduce my guest today, jazz pianist, educator, composer, and arranger, Rossano Sportiello. He is one of the world's leading jazz piano players on the scene today, specializing in styles from Harlem stride piano to bebop to contemporary jazz. And jazz piano legend Barry Harris said of Rossano is the most fabulous piano player I have ever heard in my life, indeed a master of his craft. Hear him once and you'll know what I mean. And enough said, really. So Rossano, welcome to the Nikhil Hogan Show.
It's my pleasure and my honor. Thank you so much for having me.
I am just a huge fan ever since I saw a clip of you on YouTube sitting down at what seems to be a Barry Harris workshop, and you just tear into something. I think the tune was Just One of Those Things. And I mean, please, if the audience, go onto YouTube and you have to see this video. It's unbelievable. And so, Rossano, where do we start? Let's start at the beginning. Can you tell my audience a little bit about your background? You're obviously Italian. What was your childhood like in music, and how did you end up playing jazz?
Well, I started relatively late because I was 9 years old when I touched the piano for the first time. While you hear that normally, professional pianists at the age of 3 or 4, they already play, But you see, in my family, I was the very first one to get into music in a serious way. Like my parents, of course, they love music, but no one in the family had a piano. No one in the family ever played an instrument, you see. So it was something really new. But my first love with music was not jazz or classical music. I was very much in love with the Neapolitan music, popular Neapolitan music, the great songs from Napoli, the south of Italy. There is a tradition of great songs that go back to the 1700s, and that was what I recall was giving me goosebumps as a little child,
right.
And so I wanted to play the piano to be able to play those songs. Very simple, And eventually we moved to a part of the little city where we lived, Vigevano, where I was born. And the lady next door was a piano teacher. So I told my parents, I want to take piano lessons. And that's how it started. I did only a few months with this lady, and then they put me in the local music school, Conservatory, and that's where I studied classical music. And so that was 1983. I was 9 years old. And then a few years later, when I was about 13, 14 years old, totally by accident, I heard the first jazz records, and I fell in love very much with the traditional jazz, with
right.
the Dixieland and stride piano, and that became my main interest together with classical music. And by the way, I graduated from the Conservatory at 22, but in those years, from the age of 14 to 22, I did both things at the same time, practically, and I had a very smart teacher, that classical piano teacher, that never tried to stop me, because, back in those days, it's not like today that you have conservatories with the jazz department and everybody's very tolerant.
Yeah.
In those days, most piano teachers, they wouldn't agree to see you playing anything else but classical music,
Right.
So, but my teacher was very nice, very kind to me, and he let me do what I wanted.
What was your teacher's name?
His name was Carlo Villa. Carlo Villa, he passed away about 10 years ago, unfortunately, suddenly, And but I'm very grateful to him, because it was, when you study with the same teacher from childhood until you are grown up, then teacher really becomes like a second father.
Right. And can I ask you, did you improvise or compose growing up, or was that something you developed in your teenage years?
The composition thing was always interesting me also as a child. So I have at my parents' house, some music notebooks with sketches,
Right.
Of course they sound terrible, but there was always the bug of composition. And I think this is the seed that turned later into improvisation, because improvisation and compositions are basically the same thing. One is faster than the other,
Right.
Like I think Duke Ellington said that an improvisation is a fast composition or something like that,
Right.
So the idea of creating music, the pleasure in creating music, and I used to be very fascinated even before I started to really be interested in jazz, when I would see on TV jazz piano players that they would improvise, And I remember clearly going back to the music school and asking the teacher, how do you improvise? Because I can't believe that these piano players, they can sit at the piano and all of a sudden hours of music is produced,
Yeah.
Like that. Yeah. So the bug was always there, I would say.
How did you learn jazz while you were doing conservatory classical music? Did you transcribe things off the record and memorize things that you heard on records, or did you engage a jazz teacher, or did you have a mentor? How did you learn jazz in your teenage years?
Yeah, I learned it practically just by myself. I didn't have I never had really a teacher following me in the same way I had the classical piano teacher, So especially in the first until Barry Harris. You see, I met Barry Harris when I was already 26 years old. So I started playing professionally gigs when I was 17 already, So I think when I met Barry, I was already formed. And so Barry gave me another, how can I say, big amount of inspiration, because I could finally see very close by how the sound of a jazz piano player like Barry's produced, the articulation of the phrases, all these little things that you got to experience live, because from the records it's always different. But when I was younger, I would just listen to the records and I tried to imitate, and then I would try to get hold of every possible lead sheet of songs that I could find. And I would start from those and then trying to add elements of what I thought I was hearing in the records, It's been like that since then, It's always a matter of listening to the records and then comparing to the lead sheet and then come up with your own. And that's what I've been doing all the way through.
You said in some interviews that you started out as a Dixieland pianist. Is that true?
Yes, my first band was a very amateurish Dixieland group in my hometown, and then I met some musicians from Milan, and I started playing with another Dixieland band, and then through this group, then I met other musicians that belonged to the Milano Jazz Gang. That was a very, very acclaimed Dixieland group in Italy, semi-professional. And I started playing with them when I was 18 already. And I played with this group for about 7 years. And I got the chance to learn a big chunk of repertoire from Louis Armstrong, from Jelro Morton, and also the so-called San Francisco style that was the San Francisco revival of Dixieland with Turk Murphy and Lou Waters. So really a big repertoire of, they call it Dixieland, but it's really many different things within that denomination, And that was a great school, I always tell my students, the best way to learn is to find a band that is kind enough to let you play, and then you start by assimilating their repertoire and their knowledge, and you'll improve much faster than when you're in school, believe it or not.
I'm going to jump around. So one question I have for you is, did you study so-called classical theory in your conservatory days? Or were you a piano performance major? Did you study counterpoint, harmony, that sort of thing?
Well, when I graduated, there was no distinction in, how can I say, majoring, stuff like that. It was done like this. You would do 4 years of solfeggio and theory together with piano, and you would start at age 9 in the conservatory. Today they changed it. It's more structured as a university, but back then was not like that. It was altogether 11 years. 11. So 1 year that was a kind of preparatory, and then 4 years of theory and solfeggio with piano. Then the following year, so 5th grade we called it, you were supposed to take the first exam of piano, and if you were good enough, you would pass, and then you would start studying harmony and history of music for 2 years. Then you would do the exams on those 2 disciplines, and then you would be eligible for 8th grade of piano. And 8th grade was a big time exam, because you were supposed to prepare 24 preludes and fugues from the well-tempered clavier, 23 etudes by the Gradus ad Parnassum by Clementi, and then all a bunch of pieces from the Romantic period. So it was a big exam, and so I did that. And then the last 2 years, leading to the 10th grade, you are supposed to prepare a 1 hour recital program that would stretch from the
Baroque,
the Bach, Mozart, all the way up to the 1900s. And so my recital, I did the Appassionata by Beethoven, and then I did the Carnaval by Schumann, and then one Rhapsody by Brahms, and I finished with the Bartók Suite, piano suite. And then you are supposed to show knowledge of 2 piano concertos, one before Beethoven and another one so-called modern from Beethoven on. And that was that. And so that's what I did. Then the year after the piano graduation, I went back, studied composition, and but without finishing the degree in composition, because by then I was 23 years old, and I was playing lots of gigs, and I was very much in love with the jazz piano more than anything else. And so suddenly I said, I think it's time now to just concentrate on this, because those are the years that you are supposed to invest, I think, most that you can, because those are the years that you learn the most. When you start being 30 years old, I'm afraid that it's kind of done, So you can still improve, but not as fast as when you are a teenager or in your 20s.
Can I ask a question about, because you did study composition a little bit, you were talking about in your conservatory. Now, I've asked so many jazz musicians, great ones, and how they think, and it seems to be, I guess the traditional ones do think of chord symbols. I interviewed Terry Gibbs, who knew Charlie Parker, and he doesn't know anything about 2, 5, and the numbers, but he knows chord symbols. And I just wanted to ask you, Rossano, when you think of jazz, you talked about buying lead sheets and scores and that sort of things. How do you think in jazz? Do you think of symbols? I know Barry Harris has a particular way of looking at harmony, but how do you look at chord symbols. And I want to broaden this into a larger topic.
You see, that's the point. We go back to education, but I think that was very good as a jazz piano player that I got classical harmony, if there is such a thing. But I mean harmony the way it's taught in a classical music environment. That was very good for me, because that's you are taught that only through numbers, you know. And then with the experience of the jazz and chord symbols, I learned to let those two ways to merge together, you know. And so I feel comfortable with both. But you see, the fact that I studied so much piano literature, and the fact that I already had experience with improvisation, when I started doing composition, I think I was a step ahead, you know, because the problem when you start teaching composition to me is how do you teach a musical invention that can be blended with harmony in a correct way. It's not easy to teach this. And I start believing that you gotta have some sort of natural inclination or natural music instinct, because I remember there were students that they didn't have it, and I saw the teacher struggling, you know.
Right.
It's really almost a mystery. The other thing is that maybe we'll get there one day, but we should implement in classical music schools also the study of improvisation very early, and the study of composition also very early. You know, I think it's a mistake to wait later on.
I was kind of interested when you talked about your love of Neapolitan songs. I was just curious, are you familiar with this new wave of resurgence of Italian music theory from Naples, the Partimento tradition? I'm not sure, it's very new, but this study where they found out in the conservatories of Naples that they had all these bass lines, and what they did was improvise on the bass lines in live counterpoint. I was just wondering if you were familiar with that, but it's quite interesting. You just talked about classical improvisation, and it's something we are kind of obsessed with on this show.
Yeah. But you know, that's good. That's good. You know, I'm familiar, but just by having heard about it, I didn't. But you see, when I started studying harmony during my piano studies, the first thing that you were really taught, beside all the basics, so the triads and seventh, and how you connect one chord to another in order to avoid the parallel fifth and parallel octaves and all that sort of things that you are probably very familiar with. Then, of course, was the harmonization of a bass line. And of course, we were taught to do that by sitting down at the piano with the manuscript paper and pencil. And so you had this bass line, and you had to come up with the other three voices, because this bass line...
Rossano, is that basso continuo?
Yes, kind of, yeah. In Italian, we used to call it armonizzazione del basso dato. So harmonization of a given bass. That was the way they called it. They are still calling it, you know. And then later on, we did the opposite, armonizzazione del canto dato. That means harmonization of a given melody, you know. And that we started doing that during the composition classes. But that's really I think that's the universal foundation of music, the harmonization of a bass line, you know. I think that's really where the basic mechanism, the learning of the basic mechanism of music should be learned from, the harmonization of a given bass, So
that's a lost tradition, right? Isn't it, Rossano? I feel like I was so amazed that I think it was like 10 years ago, I read that Bach and Chopin, Mozart, Debussy, they all did what you were talking about, being able to improvise off basses. They were all improvised. They were kind of like jazz musicians, right?
That's right, man. I'm telling you, we live in a time where, unfortunately, I have the impression that, like consumism, what is old, you throw it away,
Yes.
And it's such a pity, because we are making the mistake of cutting our memory by forgetting things of the past that proved themselves to be extremely valuable,
Agreed.
Because of this urge that everything has got to be new, in the teaching system, everything has to be a revolution. And of course, revolutions are important, but we shouldn't abuse, and we should be lucid enough to distinguish what is old and valuable, which elements of tradition in different fields can be still valid.
I do want to tie this with jazz. Now, you bring up a very important point. I mean, I'm known for my podcast for Partimento, but I actually am a Berklee graduate, and I want to get your opinion on this, Rossano. When I was in Berklee, I studied things like chord scales and modes, and you could call it, I guess, modern jazz theory. And I just wanted to get your opinion. I know Barry Harris is not very fond of that sort of thing, but when we talk about traditional jazz, I mean, how would you teach traditional jazz to someone who's interested in learning, and how would you contrast that? Are you familiar with the so-called modern jazz theory, and what's your opinion?
Of course. First of all, I have to tell you, I stand on the side of Barry Harris, because I believe that there is not such a thing as jazz harmony. Because
right.
I think so, because even those voicings and chords that to us they sound like jazz, we can already find much of that of those sounds in Debussy, Ravel, and then the Russians, later on, I'm thinking to that. Well, Prokofiev, of course. In Stravinsky, there is so much of what we call jazz harmony that is really taken from those composers.
I think Barry Harris's famous line, as he says, is jazz is kind of or bebop or jazz is a continuation of classical music.
That's right. Jazz is a continuation, because he says that his theory and his there is some truth in that when in the classical music they stopped improvising, then all of a sudden jazz was getting around. So it's almost like Barry says, you can't stop improvisation, So it's almost like the collective mind of humanity needs that escape valve that is improvisation. So once they stopped with classical music, all of a sudden jazz came around, and we got an incredible output of improvisation, probably like never before. I'm tempted to say, because think of all these great jazz musicians in more than 100 years, what they made up. And of course, we can relate only to the recorded material, but we are talking about thousands of musicians playing gigs everywhere and improvising every night. Think about that. And so going back to the the jazz harmony and classical harmony, I believe they are the same thing. It's only that with jazz you take some elements from really the classical music all the way to the 1900s, and then you turn it into a practical way to use it. And the example is, for example, Errol Garner. That Errol, that couldn't read music, but he could hear everything. So he would play Laura, the beautiful song, the beautiful ballad. But of course, you'd hear shades of Debussy and Ravel all the way through, So that's, and this remark is made already by Schoenberg in the introduction of his book. He says, that's what he says, that the classical composers, the great composers, come up with stuff, and then it's absorbed into popular music. I do not agree completely, but this is true. But it can be also the other way around, because we have seen later on, again in the 1900s, but also in the music of Chopin, for example, that the classical composer assimilates in his music some popular elements. So both things are true. In the case of jazz, though, harmonically speaking, I think is more prevalent the borrowing from the classical. I think I'm tempted to say so. I might be wrong, but this would be a great subject to study, and see, like studying several jazz musicians and see where are their roots in classical music, and if there are roots in classical music with their harmonic vocabulary, and then vice versa, to see which classical, we know already that Ravel probably was listening to some early jazz, and probably
Gershwin as well.
And Gershwin, of course. So I think all this is a very, very interesting topic if you are a very passionate scholar in this discipline, in harmony, jazz and classical, and see the waves of material, how they shift from one way to the other.
I'm very biased due to Partimento towards something like figured bass, but I was quite shocked. I remember I bought Barry Harris's DVD, his workshop DVD, and there's a little line that he says in the DVD where he's trying to describe his method of harmony, and he says, well, essentially what I'm doing is figured bass, and we need to find one of those old teachers who they say are too old, but that's the one we really need to find, because this is what this is figured bass.
Yeah, I believe in that. And when you play as a piano player, when you play the chord structure of a tune, and because very early I developed the ability to play in a band without the bass. So with the stride in the left hand and the walking bass, practically very often you don't need a bass player. You see? So I got more and more into the temptation. I don't do it all the time, but I do it very often, that when you play a bass line with the left hand, then you start getting into the mode of trying to harmonize every note of the bass line, and that makes an incredible, how can I say, an incredible sound, because you start getting if I play, let's see if I can do this. Let's consider just a 12-bar blues in F. So. But so you see what I mean by, and so I relate to what Barry says, because we jazz piano players sometimes forget that what you play becomes very interesting if you stop thinking of chords in a vertical way, but you start really looking into an horizontal way, and you start applying the so-called voice leading, you see. And to do that while you accompany a soloist, I think it makes it beautiful and very interesting, rather than just concentrate on stacks of notes that might sound exotic and nice, but mix the things up. If you throw in a little bit of counterpoint, that's good. That's smart.
Can I ask you, Rossano, specifically, technically? Okay, so if you're walking, what can you give a theoretical explanation for this horizontal contrapuntal thinking? So are you thinking of inverting your chord, or are you thinking of diminished chords in between the chords? How are you, can you give a technical description of what you are doing horizontally?
Well, for example, in this case, I'll tell you, very simple. The first three notes of the bass line that I played were F, G, and A. And so F, G, and A, I can harmonize that with adding just two parts on top. So I have E flat and A on the F, so F7. And then on the G, I move those two parts to E natural and B flat. And then on the A, the E goes back to E flat, and the B flat goes up to C. You see, so you really look, you try as much as you can to look at each note as a separate voice. And you try to connect one note to each other in the smoothest way, without too many jumps, in other words. And this is exactly what we were taught, in the armonizzazione del basso dato, harmonization of a given bass. But of course, when you sit down with music and paper and you have all the time, you have 1 hour, then you can also make sure that there are not parallel fifths. But the thing of the parallel fifth and parallel octaves is something that you need to learn to avoid. But then in practical playing, you just do it when it happens. It's not. You learn the rules, and then after you learn the rules, then you are allowed to break them.
Let me ask you a question. If somebody is, because the way jazz education is very popular now on the online, it's very much aligned with the modern jazz theories. How, if somebody is kind of familiar with that, what can you tell them that is different about the way you think of harmony and chords and jazz and the way you teach jazz? Maybe what is different from what you're teaching compared to what they're used to?
Well, I think that, again, like Barry says, I base my approach to improvisation and theory to the major and minor scales. That's it. And I see everything else as a consequence of that, So I don't drive myself crazy into looking at each chord and see which mode applies to that chord, even though there is the method, I don't think the method is wrong of the modes. Actually, it goes back to medieval times, when music was, there wasn't yet the supremacy of the major scale that was one of the modes and the minor scale, but it was different, it was through the centuries of evolution of music that somehow the modes went to fade, and there was the affirmation of the tonal system based on the major scale. This was a process that took centuries. So when in the jazz studies they want to bring you back to the consideration of modes, it makes sense. I'm not saying that but I think for the kind of jazz that I play, that is tonal jazz, swinging tonal jazz, you only need to know the tonal system applied to the major and minor scales with all the universe of movements and chords that implies, because it's a universe. There is so much just in that.
One thing I've noticed in Galant or 18th century music is that the key changes quite a bit from bar to bar. And it's in some ways, it's very similar to jazz. If you take a song like All the Things You Are, there's quite a number of key changes. So I want to ask you, Rossano, when you look at a jazz standard like maybe All the Things You Are you thinking chord to chord, or are you thinking several bars at a time? Are you thinking key to key? How do you, when you are improvising, what is your mind thinking like? I'm sorry if this is too technical. You probably don't even think like this, right?
Well, but, it gets to a point when you're very familiar with the tune and when you are experienced musicians, that really the thinking, it feels like the thinking is minimal, But I can go back and tell you, when I started to improvise, how I was thinking. And in my case, I think I was thinking from chord to chord, from chord to chord, and then it takes a while to start realizing that you can think to chord, but then just look at it in the context of the key that you're playing in.
So like maybe rhythm changes that, let's say rhythm changes in B flat. Are you thinking just in B flat for the A section?
Well, it can be done both ways. And we've discussed this very much with Barry, and there is lots of literature that means recording of jazz musicians doing it both ways. Like you'll hear, you can play rhythm change and really dig out every single chord, And on the other end, you can hear combos where you have the rhythm section that comes going through the chords, but then the soloist is just swinging on B flat, and it works. It works.
What is your preference, Rossano?
I like them both because if I find myself wanting really to groove, to swing, to groove, then I might stay on B flat, But if I find myself, how can I say, trying to be more elaborate, then I'll go through all the chords and maybe apply some substitutions, And of course, then we bring in the subject of chord substitutions, and that's another universe of possibilities and colors, because that's what they are. Substitutions are colors, different colors that all of a sudden the music, the music starts sounding exotic, like one melody note, like, for example, I always tell my students, if you have in a certain melody, let's say you have a C7 and the melody is holding a B flat on a C7, of course you can play a C7, but you could play a 10th in the left hand, C and E natural, and then on top you could stack a G flat triad with the B flat on top, and all of a sudden you have this. And that's an amazing different color.
Do you think of it as a G flat entity on top of a C7? Is that the way your mind would think of that?
That's a way to simplify it, but actually, if you want to describe that chord, then you call it C7 with the flat 9 and the flat 5th.
For you, practically, how does your mind work when you do these concepts? Not when you're teaching, but when you're actually doing it.
It started by codifying precisely flat 9 and flat 5th, and with experience, I came to realize that you can just think of the triton part triad stacked on top of the C, So here it is one more time. I said that before. There is always, in my case, the codification first that turns into a practical use later, and not vice versa, in my case, you see. And I think that's an important observation of my way of proceeding, But it could be the other way around, because I believe that, for example, going back to Errol Garner, some of these incredibly sophisticated chords that he played, he just heard them and played them. But I'm not sure if he really knew all the theory behind it. But I have the feeling that this is because of his genius. Let's remember that Errol Garner, this is what is in his biography said, that by the age of 3, he could sit at the piano and reproduce practically any melody that he could hear. So I'm sure, and you see, Errol Garner's practicing routine, was going to the record shop and buy a bunch of records, classical music, jazz, pop, everything. And he would come home with this stack of LPs, or 78 or whatever, and then start listening to them. And while the turntable was going and playing music, he would be smoking cigarettes and pacing back and forth in the room,
Yeah.
And then suddenly he would stop and get to the piano and play. So it's like his brain was feeding itself with all these sounds and harmonies and styles and melodies, until he felt that he had got the conception of a certain tune in his mind, and then he would stop the recorder, go to the piano and play it. So I don't think there was much codification, but there was probably this incredible capability of absorbing those sounds and those stacks of sound and then playing them just like that. They said that once he went to a classical recital of Emil Gilels, the famous Russian piano player, and then with some friends, and then they went home, and he just by memory of what he heard at the concert, he played some passages of some of the Beethoven sonatas that Gilels had performed, So that's the kind of mind that we are talking about, not a common mind for sure.
I want to turn to improvisation, and I have always tried to figure out pedagogy and figure out how people think when they improvise. And the one way that I like to think about it now is not so much scale-wise, although that's very popular. When I look at some of these old Partimento diminution treatises, for me it makes more sense when you take a vertical figure and put it horizontally and then insert the passing notes, and then it kind of is maybe like a scale, but I think of it more as a horizontal chord rather than a scale. But I would like to know how you think of improvising, and how does your mind work? Because I know Barry Harris talks about scales, but other people talk about chord scales. Some people think about modes. Some people just think of the chord symbol itself, and then they horizontalize the chord symbol and put in passing notes and approach notes and that sort of thing, like a bass player does. So, Rossano, how do you think about improvisation? What is kind of your conception?
Well, you just described it all. It's all of what you said, really. But once again, I can go back and telling you, for the students that might be listening to this, or for those who wants to start to approach improvisation. When I started, I remember clearly that I came to the conclusion that there were certain notes that didn't sound good and certain notes that sounded very good. And so I noticed that I would improvise by using the tones of the chords, and of course making melodies based on those tones with a certain rhythm, then the phrase would be always correct. You know, so it might sound simplistic, but
no.
But if you're gonna start improvising, you gotta make sure that you know exactly the notes that make each chord. You know, you cannot be hesitating when you see a G flat 7. Oh, what are the notes of that chord?
Right.
You cannot be doing that.
Right.
You know, so the first study that you gotta make, you gotta know without thinking all the major and minor scales and all the chord symbols and their inversions with both hands.
Right.
And this is very plain and simple. Now, there is another element that we forget to talk about. That is the fact that jazz is really a oral music.
Yes.
You know, something that first starts in your ear. You know, so I don't believe that you can learn jazz improvisation without a solid habit of listening to music constantly and loving to listen to music constantly, to jazz, because that's how you create a reference. If you don't have a reference in your mind, then it becomes impossible to create a phrase and have that phrase make sense. So it's the same exact thing as a spoken language, you know.
Right.
So you see, we are talking to each other now, and we are telling each other things that were not prepared. You know, this is like an improvisation, but each single word of our conversation is a word, is something that is recognized, commonly recognized by people, you know. And it's the combination of these words that will make the speech, and every speech is different from each other. And so it works the same way in improvisation. The way you build your vocabulary for improvisation is by listening to lots of music, constantly being surrounded by jazz, by a certain kind of jazz, if you prefer one style rather than the other. But that's how you create the reference, and that's how you can turn the arpeggio of a chord into a jazzy sounding phrase, because otherwise it will stay an arpeggio of a chord, you know, it won't be a phrase. So a phrase is made of notes, but it's made also of pronunciation, accents, the right intention into syncopation. So there are also these elements to be taken in consideration that you can apply if you have a clear reference in your mind of how the music is supposed to sound. I hope I'm clear with that.
Absolutely. It's fantastic. And I wanted to, just for people to get this perspective, have you transcribed a lot of solos, or do you pick parts of solos that you like and kind of compile a vocabulary that way? Or do you learn like the whole solo?
No, I think the only transcription that I made all the way through 2 years ago was a handful of keys, the Fats Waller recording, because I had to perform it at a concert, and I thought, I want to try to get as close as possible to the Fats Waller recording, and so I transcribed it, and then after I learned the transcription, I decided which parts I was going to play like Fats and which parts were going to be improvised, and I think this is an excellent study that you can make. But that was the only time that I did such a work. The kind of transcribing that I do these days is mostly when I want to learn a new song and I fall in love with a certain interpretation of that tune. So it might be either an Hank Jones version or a Tommy Flanagan, and so I transcribe the melody, the way they play it, and their harmonization. But then still, I will decide if I'm going to use all of that, or I will integrate that with some of my own, And I think this is a great way to learn tunes, learn tunes by transcribing. Regarding transcribing solos, I think that's also a very helpful tool if you have the patience and the passion to do it. I never had the patience to go through the transcription over all solos. I believed mostly in trying to understand the phrasing and the pronunciation of a certain musician. Pronunciation, I mean the articulation of 8 notes. Basically, that's what it is, and trying to imitate. Like there are very distinctive ways of playing 8 notes, and you can hear the difference. Like, for example, if you put on an early Hank Jones record, or if you listen to an early George Shearing record, compared to the way Tommy Flanagan or Barry Harris articulated 8 notes, you realize that there is a difference. And the difference, I came to the conclusion, is mostly in the space that you leave between the notes. That's really something, the space that you leave between the notes, even when you articulate 8 notes in a medium fast tempo, you can decide to play very legato or staccato or something in between, and that will make the articulation sound completely different. There are some Hank Jones records or early George Shearing records where each 8 notes sounds very distinct, like a very distinct entity. It's not staccato, but it's something in between, and that blended with that beautiful touch, ringing touch that those piano players had, that also always make me think of drops of water, falling down. Right. I can't think of any other image to describe that way of playing the piano, but it's very beautiful. And so I think it makes sense for someone that wants to study jazz piano very seriously to consider these ways of touch and these ways of articulation. It's many ways, and each one is a wonderful world in itself. So there is really so much to take into consideration. But I'm going to say that one more.
Yes.
If you are motivated by the love of the music and a strong passion and the strong desire to learn, you'll find yourself absorbing all of this really in a natural way.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, I live with my, if you would be here with me, you'll see there is the upright piano, and right beside the piano, there is the computer, and the computer is one of those with also you can still put a CD on, and so that's how I work. So I either listen to a CD and then, I practice a lot playing along with records, Again, now we forgot of this wonderful possibility, but Barry always talks about that he used to have a turntable with the adjustable speed. And so there was the way to change the speed of the record all the way to half the speed.
Yeah.
And so if you put on a record and change the speed to half, then the music would sound half as slow, and the pitch would be an octave lower. And so he said that's what he did when he wanted to learn some of the Charlie Parker phrases, or he really wanted to understand in some spots what Bud Powell was doing. That's what he did,
Fantastic.
And we shouldn't forget.
Yeah.
We shouldn't forget this approach. Sometimes I put on a Bud Powell record and I play along. And by the end of it, if you know all the tunes and you can go through the old record, the old CD that might be 45, 50 minutes of music or more, then you can see that something got stuck in yourself. You sound a little bit better,
right.
And if you do this day after day, year after year, that's how the authenticity of music starts to penetrate your DNA.
Rossano, let me jump in and let me ask you some simple questions that I'd love to get your opinion on this. So the first one is, what's your advice to playing fast, up-tempo tunes?
Yeah, that's you got to start slow. You got to start slow and little by little get to that tempo that is borderline between what is comfortable for you and what becomes uncomfortable. You use the metronome. I believe in the use of the metronome, and push it further to the point that your phrasing starts to get chopped up, but push it further. And then after a while, maybe you practice like that 15 minutes, then after a while you bring it back to the comfortable zone, and you'll find yourself that the comfortable zone is even more comfortable.
Right.
And then you start pushing it up again. And, I used to have some very drastic tempo increases, and it's a struggle. But you try as much as you can to live with that struggle. And here again, by doing it, you'll find yourself that you'll have to relax. You'll have to economize, if such a word exists in English.
It does.
To your touch, So stay close to the keys. Breathe. Take rests between phrases, because even if you're playing fast, doesn't mean that you have to play 8 notes all the way through, like crazy. No, you still have to breathe and still every phrase should be a separate entity that makes sense with each other in a consequential way, you know. But that's really what it is, you know. As a matter of fact, the other day I was trying again, so I started with the metronome put on the half note at 160, and it felt comfortable. And so I pushed it to 180, and it was not so comfortable anymore. So I pushed it down to 200, very fast, very uncomfortable. And then back to 160, all of a sudden, 160 felt way more comfortable. And that's what you got to do. That's what you got to do. There is no escape, but just by trying and finding that balance so that the articulation and the thinking start working together in an harmonic way rather than fighting each other.
There's something unbelievable about your musicianship, which is, I noticed that you cited as an influence Dave McKenna. And,
yes.
And there's one thing that I love when a pianist who can do this, and it's very, very rare, and you're one of them, is you have a walking bass line and you have a running right hand at the same time, improvising. And it just seems like how many sides of your brain are you using? And I want to understand, how did you develop that incredible ability?
Yeah, this is also a step-by-step learning experience. You see, I started, when I started studying walking bass line, I was maybe 15, 16 years old. And I came to the conclusion that I could walk bass lines without putting too much thinking, just by using the major and minor triad, or the arpeggio of the chord, in other words, in the left hand, you know. So this way, you would have your left hand playing always the right notes with a 4/4 rhythm, 4 beats a bar, and still being able to concentrate on the phrasing of the right hand. And then, of course, you mentioned that before, I started realizing that in between those triads, I could add passing tones, you know. And so I started practicing bass lines with as many passing tones I could use, so that there would be no intervals. I wouldn't use very much intervals more than a whole step, you know. And I found myself that little by little that became very comfortable. And you see, comfortable with piano playing means that you can do that. Once again, I'm saying this, having the impression that you don't put much thinking effort in it. And so that leaves space again to elaborate your inventions in the right hand. And that's how it proceeded, you know. There is also a way, because you see, I think it's very hard to improvise new stuff, new lines with both hands in the same time. So it has to be like you can go crazy with the bass line if you are playing some comfortable stuff in the right hand, and vice versa. And by saying comfortable means that you are applying a vocabulary that is known to yourself. Because if you try to venture yourself in phrases in the right hand that are out, you know, then your attention gets switched to that, and of course the left hand might go into territories that are more comfortable. So there is also all that, you know. So it might sound like there is complete independence, but I think a lot of that is a myth. You just find ways to make it sound good.
But I
and
mean, isn't
swinging
improvisation
yeah.
just a lot of memorization of small pieces? And it is improvisation because you are drawing from what you've amassed. So it really is improvisation.
Well, it depends how you look at it. It depends how you look at it. But you see, Dave McKenna, he went a step further because he used to be called the three-handed piano player.
Right.
Because with Dave, you really hear the bass line and the melody, but then you hear also chords, very distinct chords in between. And the amazing thing is that he makes those, that bass, that melody and those chords, he makes them sound in a distinct way. So almost like I have the impression like those parts were overdubbed, like you first, It's very impressive.
Yeah.
Very impressive. And in recent years, after Dave passed away, now on YouTube you find more and more videos, and it's amazing. Like if you just, when I used to listen to him, I thought that he would be jumping all over the keyboard, but then now that we have the possibility to watch what he was doing, there is very little movement. Man, it's impressive with very little movement and almost no pedal, like he would create all of that with this, just with his fingers, and with a very economical, once more, very economical movement of the fingers, I mean, a real genius of piano that didn't get wider recognition. I mean, among certain musicians, is considered like a god, But I don't know how well known Dave is to the general public,
Here's another question: do you hum or sing, either externally or internally, when you improvise?
Yes, a lot, and sometimes you can hear it, and it gets a little bit in the way, It's like more than a singing, it becomes a grunting sometimes, But it seems like at times you cannot fully play your potential if you don't get engaged in that humming or whatever you want to call it. Very, very, very weird. There are musicians that they were very famous for doing that very loud.
Yep.
Bud Powell and Harold Gardner did it very, very loud, and Oscar Peterson did it.
The grunting.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, so it's been really what an honor. I wanted to ask you a couple of fun questions now, just to end off. It's nice to end on a lighter note. And so, one question I wanted to ask you was, if you could play with any jazz musician in history, who would you play with, and why?
Oh my, that's hard because there are so many.
Yeah.
That becomes very hard to pick one. To pick one, it becomes very hard.
Yep.
Maybe, it's very hard. It seems like if I mention one,
give me three then.
It's like,
I'll make it slightly less harder.
Let's see. I would say Louis Armstrong.
Okay.
Art Tatum, even though, but I would have just loved to be able to be near Art Tatum,
yeah.
I would say Louis Armstrong, Art Tatum, and Charlie Parker.
Wonderful.
Let's put it that way. Yeah.
What is your proudest musical moment?
Oh wow, my proudest musical moment. Even in this case, there are quite a few But you see, I might mention one particularly.
Okay.
That you see, my father, that is, my parents, you see, are still relatively young. They are in their mid-70s. But my father very hardly gave me a compliment with what I was doing with the music. I mean, my parents supported what I wanted to do all the way through. Even maybe sometimes they wouldn't agree, but eventually they supported my choices. But my father was very difficult that he would give me a compliment, And I believe that's also the reason why I always try to get better within my possibilities, in a very humble way. But then when I did my final graduation in classical piano, he came to hear the graduation, as I told you, was just a recital in front of a panel of teachers. And those recitals were open to the public, so people could come and hear. Of course, my father came, and the performance went well. The teachers seems to be happy. So I remember when we left the room, then he gave me a hug with a couple of tears, And so I think that was meant a lot.
Okay, so let me ask you another one. This might be fun for people who, I mean, you do some incredible things, but what is the hardest tune for you to play? Do you have a tune that is difficult?
Well, there are many. But for example, for many years, I avoided to play Lush Life, because I saw it like something that only a few can touch and make sense out of it and make it beautiful, It took years before I started feeling comfortable with that song, and I would say Lush Life. You see, I believe also in the fact that you become an accomplished part of being an accomplished musician is also the ability to effortlessly transpose. And I always looked at Lush Life as a tune that if you can transpose the verse and chorus of that one, then you are on a good path,
Final thing is, here's my final question, Rossano. You've been such an incredible guest. You have recorded many albums. If someone wanted to be introduced to the music of Rossano Sportiello, what 3 albums would you recommend?
I would recommend the newest one, because the newest one that just came out 6 months ago, about 6 months ago, that's right. It's called That's It, on the Arbors Records label. I think this album, it's really reflects my maturity. I think I was able with these, if I remember well, 17 tracks, to put all that I am pianistically in a jazzy way. It's all there. I'm very, very satisfied with that. And also for the first time, there are, I think, 5 original compositions of mine, So I think that album will give the idea really of who I am pianistically and from the jazz point of view. And before that, I would say Pastel, that is another piano solo that I did a few years back. So, and as a sideman, I did several recordings with the tenor saxophone player Harry Allen. And so those are also good for those who are interested in the way to comp behind, within a band, in a rhythm section, behind the soloist. So I think those are good, But I say it once again, for someone that never heard me, I think the last record is the best introduction.
Fantastic.
Let's put it that way.
Wonderful. Well, what can I say? I mean, it's been a real privilege to speak with you today, Rossano. I'm a huge fan. And please, can you tell my audience what you have planned for the rest of the year and how they can contact you to buy your music, subscribe? Please subscribe to this man's YouTube channel. It's unbelievable. And you can also contact him for private lessons. How can they reach out to you? And please tell my audience what you have planned.
Well, still the traveling and performing because of the coronavirus is still shaky a little bit. But about 8 months ago, I started live streaming from home, and I've been doing a show that is called Live at the Flat in Greenwich Village. All these live streams, they're all available to watch on my website, rossanosportiello.com. And also through the website, you can contact me if you want lessons or for anything else, rossanosportiello.com. So if you want, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel, or you can put a follow or a like to my Facebook page. The streams also always are streamed both on YouTube and Facebook. So you can do all of this if you want.
Well, I mean, thank you so much, Rossano. I hope you had a good time on the Nikhil Hogan Show. Let's chat again soon in the future. Bye-bye.
It was wonderful, and thank you so much.